Can luxury, which millions dream of, become the cruelest prison for the soul? We are used to seeing ladies in silk and diamonds in old portraits, their faces expressing only calmness and majesty. But behind those frozen smiles lay decades of suppressed tears, unspoken grievances, and absolute loneliness in crowded halls. The era known as the Gilded Age was, in fact, a time when the glitter of gold only masked the rust of human relationships. The women of that time owned entire fortunes, but did not even have the right to vote in their own homes. Their fates were decided behind closed doors in offices, where fathers and husbands signed contracts, trading living people for titles and shares. History remembers the balls and receptions, but it has forgotten the silence that fell when the candles went out. Watch the video to the end to find out how a single mistake in choosing a dress could forever ruin a future, and why the richest heiresses in the world envied their maids. What if I told you that the famous balls of the past were not celebrations, but carefully planned auctions? Each season of high society began with the presentation of young girls to society, and this event resembled a military parade rather than a party. Mothers spent years preparing their daughters for this moment, as if they were gladiators entering the arena. A girl had to have perfect posture, impeccable manners, and a complete lack of her own opinion. Any display of character or lively emotions could be considered vulgar and lower her market value. In the ballrooms, flooded with the light of thousands of candles, the air was saturated not only with the scent of expensive perfumes, but also with a sticky fear. The young ladies knew that hundreds of eyes were watching them, evaluating every detail of their outfits and every movement of their fans. The men standing by the walls discussed not the beauty of the debutantes, but the size of their dowries and the influence of their fathers. It was a cold calculation in which love and sympathy played virtually no role. Marriage was a deal to merge capital, and the girl was only a guarantor of this union. The worst nightmare for any family was to be left without a marriage proposal by the end of the season. This meant public humiliation and the stigma of failure, which cast a shadow over the entire family. Mothers resorted to any tricks to marry off their daughters, often ignoring their tears and pleas. They convinced themselves and those around them that they were acting for the good of their children, ensuring them a stable future. But behind this concern often lay a desire to improve the family's faltering financial situation. The dresses we see in museums today were real instruments of torture for their owners. Tight corsets not only shaped the waist, they literally made it impossible to breathe deeply. In such an outfit, it was impossible to relax for a second. One had to keep one's back straight at all times. This physical restriction became a metaphor for the entire life of a woman of that time. She was bound by the constraints of propriety as tightly as her body was bound by whalebone. The wedding became a grand spectacle, the final act of the sale, decorated with white flowers and lace. Newspapers described the ceremony in detail, admiring the luxury and beauty of the couple. But no one wrote about how the bride felt as she walked down the aisle with a man she was indifferent to. Society applauded the successful deal, and the doors of the golden cage slammed shut forever. A life full of silence and outward appearances began. I'm very interested to hear your opinion on such traditions. What do you think about mothers who had gone through this themselves, pushing their daughters down the same path? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about how American millions saved the British aristocracy from ruin? At the end of the 19th century, a unique phenomenon arose. Wealthy American heiresses married impoverished English lords en masse. They were called dollar princesses, and their fates often became the subject of tragic novels. Girls who had grown up in the comfort of modern New York mansions, with central heating and running water, found themselves in damp medieval castles. The title sounded beautiful, but life on the ancestral estates was horrific. Loneliness became a constant companion for these women in the huge, echoing corridors of unfamiliar houses. Their husbands often lived their own lives, spending time hunting, in clubs, or with mistresses. The wife was left alone, surrounded by portraits of unfamiliar ancestors who seemed to condemn her presence. She had no one to talk to, as she did not know the local rules and codes of communication. Letters home were her only outlet, but even in them she had to lie about her happiness. American women were accustomed to greater freedom and openness, which was considered bad form in England. Their loud laughter, direct gaze, and desire to discuss serious topics shocked the prim society. They had to break themselves, learn to be quiet, inconspicuous, and reserved. This suppression of their own nature led to deep depression and nervous breakdowns. But they couldn't complain because they got what they paid for, a title. The money they brought home went to maintain the estate, but the mistress herself often had no right to dispose of it. Under English law at the time, a wife's fortune came under her husband's control. She could ask him for money for her personal needs, as if she were a little girl. This humiliating situation came as a complete surprise to independent American women. They bought the dream of a fairy tale, but ended up in financial and moral dependence. Winters in English estates were particularly painful due to the lack of proper heating. Women froze in their bedrooms, wrapped in shawls while their husbands economized on coal. Dampness penetrated everywhere, ruining expensive dresses and causing constant colds. But complaints about the cold were seen as a sign of weakness and pampering. Aristocrats prided themselves on their ability to endure discomfort, considering it a sign of class. Do you think high social status is worth giving up emotional warmth and freedom for? Watch the video to find out what happened to those who did decide to rebel against the system. Want to know the secret that doctors of the time used to pacify rebellious wives? In the Victorian era, in the Gilded Age, any emotional outburst by a woman could be grounds for diagnosis. If a lady showed excessive independence, complained of boredom or unhappiness in her marriage, she was declared to be suffering from a nervous disorder. Medicine at that time was a convenient tool for social control, allowing inconvenient women to be isolated. Instead of solving problems, society preferred to declare them a medical deviation. The most popular method of treatment was the so-called rest, or rest in a dark room. Women were prescribed weeks or even months in bed, in complete isolation. She was forbidden to read, write, do needlework, or even talk. It was believed that any mental activity depleted the female body and harmed the reproductive system. In fact, it was imprisonment in her own home, designed to break her will. It was believed that women were weak by nature and prone to hysteria. Any behavior that went beyond the strict norms of etiquette was classified as such. Loud laughter, tears, and the desire to argue were all symptoms of illness. The ideal was an apathetic, quiet doll who did not cause trouble for those around her. It was this ideal that doctors sought to bring their patients to. Many talented women, writers, and artists went through this hell. Their creative energy, finding no outlet, destroyed them from within. They were told that their talent was an illness that had to be cured for the sake of family happiness. The ban on creativity was the cruelest punishment for gifted individuals. Society feared intelligent women and did everything it could to neutralize them. Thousands of women lived their lives considering themselves sick and abnormal, simply because they wanted something more than embroidery by the fireplace. Their potential was buried under diagnoses and prescriptions. It was a tragedy of unrealized potential for an entire generation. Don't forget to like this if you are also struck by such methods of caring for women's health. Guess how many rules a woman had to follow just to leave the house? The life of a high society lady was like walking through a minefield where every step was regulated by the strictest etiquette. There were rules for everything: how to hold a cup, how to bow your head, how to respond to a greeting. The slightest deviation from the norm was noticed and condemned by society instantly. Etiquette was not just a set of good manners, but a complex system of restrictions that stifled any spontaneity. Visits were one of the main duties and became a tedious ritual. You couldn't just drop in on a friend. You had to leave a calling card at a specific time. The duration of the visit was strictly regulated. Staying 5 minutes longer was considered indecent. Conversations had to be limited to neutral, safe topics. Any sincerity or discussion of problems was strictly forbidden. At the table, a woman had to eat like a bird, even if she was hungry. There was a complex language of cutlery that had to be known perfectly. Making a mistake in choosing a fish fork was a disgrace that could be whispered about for weeks. Laughing loudly was vulgar, being silent was stupid, and talking too intelligently was indecent. A woman had to walk a fine line, entertaining guests without drawing too much attention to herself. Communicating with men was a particular challenge. A lady was not allowed to speak to a gentleman first unless they had been introduced. She could not remain alone with a man in a room, even for a minute. Her gaze had to be modest, slightly lowered, but not wandering. Any direct eye contact could be interpreted as flirtatious or promiscuous. Clothing was also subject to a strict schedule: morning dress, walking dress, tea dress, evening dress. Women had to change 5 or 6 times a day, and each change required the help of a maid. Women were slaves to their wardrobes, spending hours lacing and buttoning. It was unacceptable to appear at dinner in a tea dress. It would be an insult to the hosts. All these rules created an impenetrable armor behind which no living person could be seen. Women were turned into functions, into a set of correct gestures and phrases. Their personalities were erased under the weight of conventions. Life became an endless performance where it was impossible to step out of character for even a second. Etiquette protected society from chaos, but it killed humanity in people. It replaced sincere relationships with a surrogate of politeness. In this world, form was valued above content, and outward propriety was more important than inner purity. Do you think that modern rules of propriety put the same pressure on people? In the next chapter, you will learn how the very architecture of houses divided families. Houses of that era were built not for comfort, but to demonstrate status and divide people. The layout of Gilded Age mansions was a physical embodiment of social distance. Huge spaces, long corridors, and numerous doors created barriers even between the closest relatives. Spouses often had separate bedrooms, connected only by a formal door that could remain closed for years. Everyone's personal space was inviolable, but it was the inviolability of a solitary confinement cell. There was a clear division between the male and female halves of the house. Men spent their time in the library, smoking room, or billiard room, dark rooms decorated with wood and leather. Women were practically forbidden to enter these areas, which were reserved for men's conversations and business. The women's territory was the boudoir and the morning room, decorated in light colors. These worlds only intersected in the dining room or the formal living room, and even then only at strictly defined times. Children lived their own separate lives on the upper floors, in their bedrooms. Their world was separated from that of their parents by staircases and servants. Meetings with parents were regulated, half an hour after tea or a short visit before bedtime. Mothers did not rock their babies or play with them on the carpet. That was the nanny's job. The architecture of the house severed the natural bond between mother and child. Servants moved around the house on their own invisible routes, black staircases and hidden corridors. They appeared out of nowhere to carry out orders and disappeared back into the shadows. The masters and servants lived under the same roof, but in parallel realities, trying not to notice each other's presence. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance where you had no real privacy. The interiors were overloaded with details: figurines, vases, paintings in heavy frames, carpets. Things displaced people, taking up all the free space. It seemed that the house belonged to objects and people only served their existence. In such an environment, it was difficult to breathe, both physically and morally. The lack of common areas where the family could simply sit together without formalities alienated people. There was no place where one could be oneself, take off one's mask, and relax. Each room required a certain behavior and appearance. The house was not a fortress, but a stage with decorations. In these luxurious interiors, people felt small and insignificant. The architecture suppressed personality, emphasizing the grandeur of lineage and money. Man was mortal and weak, while the house stood for centuries, keeping its cold secrets. The golden cage was built to last for centuries, and it was impossible to escape from it. What if I told you that fashion can be a form of physical restriction of freedom? The women's costume of the late 19th century was a complex engineering structure designed to make a woman beautiful, but completely helpless. The weight of a full outfit with petticoats, bustle, and trimmings could reach 10 to 15 kilograms. Carrying such a heavy load every day was exhausting work that required the endurance of a soldier. At the heart of it all was the corset, a rigid frame that compressed the ribs and internal organs. The lacing was tightened so tightly that the volume of the lungs was reduced by a third. Women literally could not breathe deeply, which led to constant fainting. This was considered a sign of aristocratic refinement, but in reality it was the result of oxygen deprivation. Deformation of the chest and displacement of organs were the usual price to pay for a wasp waist. Skirts were long and voluminous, sweeping up dust and dirt from the streets. To take a step, one had to overcome the resistance of the fabric. Climbing stairs in such an outfit was a real test of coordination. Women were shackled by their own clothing. They could not run, turn sharply, or bend over quickly. The sleeves were often cut in such a way that it was impossible to raise her arms above her shoulders. This made women dependent on the help of others, even for small things. She could not comb her hair or put on a hat without assistance. Clothes turned her into a disabled person in need of constant care. This emphasized her status as the weaker sex in need of male protection. The fabrics were expensive but impractical. Velvet, silk, brocade. They could not be washed, only dry cleaned, so any stain was a tragedy. Women had to constantly watch out for getting dirty, which restricted their movements even more. They sat motionless, like porcelain dolls, afraid of ruining their outfits. Accessories, hats with stuffed birds, heavy jewelry, fans, added to the discomfort. All of this had to be worn with dignity, without showing how heavy and hot it was. In summer, the layers of clothing turned into a real sauna. Sweat poured under the corset, causing skin irritation, but scratching was strictly forbidden by etiquette. Fashion was another way of showing women their place, the place of a beautiful but immobile object. They were supposed to adorn the world but not act in it. The shackles of silk and lace were stronger than iron chains. Do you think modern women are willing to endure such discomfort for the sake of beauty? In the next chapter, you will learn how society punished those who strayed. Reputation at that time was a currency more solid than gold, and it could be lost in an instant. Fear of public opinion paralyzed the will and forced people to hide any family problems. The main rule was, never wash your dirty laundry in public. Whatever happened behind closed doors, infidelity, ruin, drunkenness, the facade had to remain impeccable. Women were the main keepers of this secret, cementing the cracks in family well-being with their silence. Divorce was practically impossible and meant social death. A divorced woman was no longer accepted in respectable homes and was not greeted on the street. She became an outcast, damaged goods, rejected even by her own parents. Therefore, wives endured any humiliation in order to maintain their status as married women. Status was the only protection in a world where a single woman was nobody. Newspaper gossip was a terrible weapon. Society chroniclers hunted for sensational stories, and any careless word could end up in print. Appearing in the newspapers in a negative context was a nightmare for any family. People lived with an eye on what Princess Maria Alexeyevna would say. This dependence on the opinions of others poisoned their existence. Husbands' extramarital affairs were often an open secret that everyone knew about, but kept quiet. Wives had to pretend not to notice anything and smile warmly at their husbands' mistresses at receptions. This required superhuman composure and acting skills. Scenes of jealousy were considered a sign of poor upbringing and hysteria. If a woman slipped up, there was no forgiveness. Double standards were the norm. What was forgiven in a man as mischief became an indelible shame for a woman. Her name was crossed off guest lists, and her portraits could be tucked away in a far corner of the attic. She disappeared from society as if she had never existed. Friendship between women also suffered from this climate of mistrust. It was impossible to be completely open with a friend, because tomorrow she could become an enemy and use your secrets against you. Sincerity was dangerous. Relationships were built on superficial pleasantries and caution. This constant fear of scandal made people hostages to their own lies. They did not live their own lives, but those approved by society. Happiness was sacrificed for reputation and truth for propriety. It was a world of crooked mirrors where the reflection was more important than the original. Education for women of high society was decorative, designed to entertain rather than develop. Girls were taught pleasant talents, piano, singing, watercolor painting, and embroidery. Serious subjects, history, politics, philosophy, were considered harmful to the delicate female mind. It was believed that a woman who was too intelligent would scare men away and be a poor mother. Books were strictly censored. Novels were considered dangerous because they could awaken unnecessary fantasies and feelings. Girls were allowed to read edifying literature and religious texts. Access to real information about the world was limited. Women were kept in a state of artificial infantilism, preventing them from maturing intellectually. The lack of serious pursuits led to monstrous boredom. The days dragged on endlessly, filled with meaningless rituals. The mind, deprived of nourishment, began to devour itself. Women suffered from feelings of uselessness and emptiness. Embroidering yet another pillowcase could not fill the spiritual vacuum. Conversations in society salons were superficial. They discussed the weather, fashion, and mutual acquaintances. Any attempt by a woman to talk about politics or science was met with polite bewilderment or ridicule. Men smiled condescendingly as if a child were speaking. A woman was supposed to listen and admire, not express her opinion. Many possessed sharp minds and organizational skills that had nowhere to be applied. Housekeeping was the only sphere where a woman could exercise authority, but even there, the final word belonged to her husband. Potential scientists, writers, and politicians died in their living rooms, never having realized their potential. Letters and diaries became their only outlet. In them, women poured out their hearts, wrote poetry, and reflected on life. These yellowed pages, found by descendants, often amazed with their depth of thought and power of feeling. They reveal the rich inner world hidden behind the mask of the socialite. Intellectual hunger was no less painful than physical hunger. Women felt they were capable of more, but the doors of opportunity were closed. It was a tragedy of unfulfilled potential, of minds suffocating without the air of freedom. The wealth of the family did not mean the wealth of the woman. More often than not, she was merely a temporary custodian of money, passing it from her father to her husband. Before the adoption of laws on the property rights of married women, everything a bride owned automatically became the property of her spouse. A woman who brought millions into a marriage could have no money of her own. She had to ask her husband for money for pins and dresses, accounting for every penny she spent. This created a humiliating dependence. A husband could gamble away his wife's fortune, spend it on horse racing or another woman, and the law was on his side. The wife could only watch helplessly as her inheritance melted away. She had no say in financial matters, even if they concerned the future of her children. Widows found themselves in a precarious position. The inheritance often passed to a son or other male relative, and the widow received only an allowance. She went from being the mistress of the house to a lodger in her own home. She was given a widow's cottage and a modest pension, which was barely enough to maintain her accustomed lifestyle. The fear of poverty forced women to stay in the most unhappy marriages. There was nowhere to go. They had no profession, no money of their own, no survival skills. The world outside the gates of the mansion was hostile and frightening. It was safer to stay in a golden cage than to end up on the street. The dowry was a sword of Damocles. If it was small, a woman could be reproached for it all her life. If it was large, she was viewed as a bag of money, with the fear that she would become too demanding. Money poisoned relationships, turning them into accounting reports. Women could not enter into contracts, open bank accounts, or conduct business without their husband's consent. Legally, they were equated with minor children or the insane. This legal invisibility made them defenseless against arbitrariness. A husband could do whatever he wanted with the family budget. Financial dependence was the foundation on which male power rested. As long as a woman did not have her own wallet, she did not have her own will. Money was a chain that held tighter than any lock. The realization of this came too late. Time was relentless, and the dazzling beauties of the Gilded Age grew old, losing their main value in the eyes of society, their beauty. Old age was a tragedy for a society lady. She went from being a trophy to a respected matron whose role was reduced to watching over the next generation of debutantes. Men's attention waned, balls became tedious, and mirrors became enemies. But the tragedy was not in the wrinkles, but in the realization of the emptiness of a life lived. Looking back, many realized that they had never truly lived. They had fulfilled their duties, followed the rules, kept silent, but were not happy. This bitter truth was the heaviest consequence of a brilliant life. However, the most frightening thing was that they passed on this legacy of bondage to their daughters. Mothers who themselves suffered from restrictions fanatically imposed the same corsets and the same rules on their children. They believed that this was how they were protecting them, that there was simply no other way. The circle was complete, and history repeated itself. They took their secrets to the grave, leaving us only legends of a beautiful life. But if you listen carefully, you can hear their whispers in the rustle of old dresses and the creak of parquet floors in museum estates. They ask us not to repeat their mistakes. They ask us to live, love, and speak the truth while we still have the right to do so. Their sacrifice was not in vain if, looking at them, we learned to value our freedom. The freedom to choose whom to love, what to do, and how to live. This is the legacy they could not have, but which we must preserve. The story of Victorian women is a lesson in empathy and a warning. Behind the facade of success, there can be deep pain, and true strength is not in suffering in silence, but in finding the courage to break the silence. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. May their voices finally be heard. We have lifted the heavy velvet curtains and peered into the dark corners of the Gilded Age. We saw that history is not only dates and battles, but also the fates of people whose pain was hidden behind polite smiles. These women lived in a world of incredible beauty and monstrous bondage. Their silence was their shield and their curse. Today we live in a different world, but the echoes of those times still resonate. We still face pressure from society, imposed standards and expectations. But we have something they did not have: the right to vote and the right to choose. Let us appreciate this and remember those who paid for it with their lives. What topics from the lives of women in history would you like us to explore in future videos? Perhaps the fates of governesses or the secrets of royal favorites? Write your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new journeys into the mysteries of the past.